Welcome to our inquiry into the civil rights movement. In the early decades of the 20th century, African Americans continued their struggle for equal protection of the laws. Though the movement for civil rights enjoyed some early successes, the century was nearly half over before momentous victories by civil rights activists finally began to change the status of African Americans in revolutionary ways. These victories were the result of strong leadership at the helm of the movement, the effective strategies used by activists, and a national government that was finally ready to fulfill the promise of equality embodied in the Declaration of Independence. In the early years of the 20th century, the political climate was open to reform, with activists in the progressive movement calling for an end to government corruption, reforms to labor laws, and protection of children from abusive labor practices, and an expansion of rights, including the rights of women to vote and the civil rights of African Americans. In 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois, an influential African-American writer and scholar, who is today acknowledged as the father of social science, joined with Oswald Garrison Villard, publisher of the New York Evening Post, an influential newspaper, and grandson of the abolitionist leader William Lloyd Garrison, to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. One of the targets of the NAACP for the next several decades was the separate but equal doctrine, which remained in place through the first half of the 20th century. Citing the lack of graduate schools, law schools, and medical schools for African Americans, the NAACP argued that the states had violated the Equal Protection Clause by failing to make such schools available to African Americans. During the 1930s, lawsuits brought by the NAACP in several states ended discriminatory admissions practices in professional schools. Momentum in the movement for equality continued to grow, fueled in part by the growing political activism of African American soldiers returning home after fighting against fascism abroad during World War II. Many of these soldiers began to question why they were denied freedom and equality in their own country, and they mobilized for civil rights in their communities. Though the court had not yet overturned the separate but equal doctrine by 1950, the Supreme Court had ruled that segregating classrooms, dining rooms, or library facilities in colleges, universities, and professional schools was unconstitutional. Taking cues from those court decisions, by the 1950s the NAACP and other groups had changed their tactics. Instead of arguing that states had to provide equivalent schools and programs for African Americans and whites, these groups began to argue that segregation itself was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. But it was not until 1954 that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the separate but equal doctrine, finding it inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. In the fall of 1951, Oliver Brown, a welder at the Santa Fe Railroad Yard in Topeka, Kansas, sought to have his daughter Linda enrolled in the third grade in an all-white public school 7 blocks from their home. The act was not accidental. It was the calculated first step in the NAACP legal strategy that would result in sweeping changes to the nation's public school system, effectively shattering the segregated school system dominant in the South. The Browns lived in an integrated neighborhood in Topeka, and Topeka schools were segregated, as allowed but not required under Kansas state law. Oliver Brown spoke with a Topeka attorney and with the Topeka NAACP, which persuaded him to join a lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education. Brown agreed and was directed to attempt to register Linda at the all-white public school. Linda was denied admission. The stand taken by Oliver Brown and the other plaintiffs was not in vain. Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first African American to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court, argued the case, and in a unanimous decision in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka that segregated schools violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In one stroke, the court concluded that separate but equal schools were inherently unequal because they stamped African American children with a badge of racial inferiority that stayed with them throughout their lives. In a second case the following year, sometimes called the Second Brown Decision or Brown II, the court grappled with the issue of how the first Brown decision should be implemented, recognizing that many southern states would be reluctant to enforce the decision unless they were made to do so. In its decision, the justices called on the states to dismantle the segregated school system with all deliberate speed, but left it to local officials to determine how to achieve a desegregated system. Many have criticized the court's unwillingness or inability to provide more concrete guidelines to local and state officials, contending that the court's failure to act ultimately undermined the impact of the Brown opinion. Nevertheless, the court's decision in this case signaled both a new era in civil rights law and a governmental climate favorable to changing centuries-long inequality in American society. In December 1955, a now legendary woman named Rosa Parks was on a bus returning home from work as a seamstress at a Montgomery, Alabama department store. In Montgomery and throughout the South, buses were segregated, with white riders boarding in the front and sitting front to back, and African American riders sitting back to front. The bus driver asked the 43-year-old African American woman to give up her seat for a white man. Parks refused and was arrested for violating a local segregation law. The Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, of which Parks and her husband were active members, had sought a test case to challenge the constitutionality of the state's Jim Crow laws. Parks agreed to participate in the case, and her arrest came at a pivotal time in the civil rights movement. Activists were buoyed by the Brown decision. Momentum favored the civil rights activists in the South, and their cause was bolstered when civil rights and religious leaders in Montgomery chose a 27-year-old preacher, relatively new to the city, to lead a bus boycott to protest Parks' arrest and the segregated public facilities. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr. The year-long bus boycott garnered national media attention, and King became a national symbol for the civil rights movement. King's leadership skills were put to the test during the year-long battle. He was arrested. His home was bombed. Death threats were made against him. But for 381 days, the buses of Montgomery remained virtually empty, representing a serious loss in revenue to the city and causing the NAACP to be banned in the state of Alabama. African Americans walked to and from work, day in and day out, for over a year. White employers drove some domestic servants to and from work. Finally, in December 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were unconstitutional. The bus boycott was a success on many fronts. Its righteousness was confirmed by the Supreme Court. The protests garnered national media attention and evoked public sympathy, and the civil rights movement had gained an articulate leader who was capable of unifying and motivating masses, and who had an effective strategy for challenging the racism of American society. King advocated protesting government-sanctioned discrimination through civil disobedience and peaceful demonstrations. African American students, as well as white students and other civil rights activists from throughout the country, used the tactics of a civil disobedience, including boycotts, sit-ins, and marches, to challenge the policies of segregation. One such demonstration was held in August 1963, in which hundreds of thousands of black and white Americans heard King deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. One famous series of marches occurred in early March 1965 from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. On Sunday, March 7th, about 600 civil rights activists began a march out of Selma, protesting the policies of intimidation and violence that prevented African Americans from registering to vote. The demonstrators, led by John Lewis, now a Democratic member of Congress from Georgia, walked only 6 blocks to Edmund Pettus Bridge, where law enforcement officials, including Alabama state troopers and members of the Sheriff's Office of Dallas County, Alabama, were waiting. When the peaceful protesters attempted to cross the bridge, law enforcement officials brutally attacked them, using tear gas, bullwhips, and nightsticks. Dubbed Bloody Sunday, the march and the beatings were televised nationally and were instrumental in swaying public opinion in favor of civil rights. The marches sparked a renewed focus on the lack of voting rights for African Americans and ultimately helped to pressure Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. King, who was not present at Bloody Sunday March, returned to Selma to lead another march on the following Tuesday. When law enforcement officers again confronted the marchers at the bridge, King asked his followers to kneel in prayer and then turn around and return to their starting point. Critics charged that King was giving in to law enforcement and questioned his nonviolent tactics. Differences over the use of nonviolent civil disobedience generated divisions within the civil rights movement, with the more militant leaders such as Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X advocating more aggressive tactics. Although the violence used against protesters generated positive opinions of the civil rights movement, another form of violence, urban riots, eroded feelings of goodwill towards the movement. For 5 days in 1965, rioting in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles resulted in 34 deaths, more than 1,000 injuries, and over 4,000 arrests. Though the immediate cause of the violence was an altercation between white police officers and an African-American man who had been arrested for drunk driving, the frustration and anger that spilled over had long been brewing in this poor, predominantly African-American neighborhood. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of African-American sanitation workers who were striking for equal treatment and pay with white workers. Standing on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel, King was killed by an assassin's bullet. Heartbreak, hopelessness, and despair followed King's assassination, a feeling manifested in part by further rioting in over 100 cities. Many Americans, both black and white, objected to the looting depicted in nightly news broadcasts. But those who sympathized with the rioters noted that because of the accumulated injustices against African Americans, the government and the rule of law had lost legitimacy in the eyes of those who were rioting. The civil rights movement is credited not only with ending segregation in public schools, but also with the desegregation of public accommodations, such as buses, restaurants, and hotels, and with promoting universal suffrage. As a result of the movement, Congress passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which aggressively sought to counter nearly 100 years of disenfranchisement, as well as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which bars racial discrimination in accommodations and private employment, and the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in housing. Simultaneously expanding the rights of many Americans and providing them with important protections from discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 includes provisions that mandate equality on numerous fronts. First, it outlaws arbitrary discrimination in voter registration practices within the states. Secondly, it bans discrimination in public accommodations, including hotels, restaurants, and theaters. Thirdly, it prohibits state and local governments from banning access to public facilities on the basis of race, religion, or ethnicity. Third, it empowers the U.S. Attorney General to sue to desegregate public schools. Next, it bars government agencies from discrimination and imposes the threat of the loss of federal funding if an agency violates the ban. It empowers the U.S. Attorney General to sue to desegregate public schools. And lastly, it establishes a standard of equality in employment opportunity. The last part of the Act, Title VII, which establishes the equality standard in employment opportunity, provides the legal foundation for a body of laws that regulates fair employment practices. Specifically, Title VII bans discrimination in employment based on inherent characteristics, race, national origin, religion, and sex. Title VII also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, a government body that still administers Title VII today. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 sought to address discrimination in access to public accommodations, employment, and education, many civil rights leaders believed that further legislation was necessary to protect the voting rights of African Americans in the South because they had been so systematically intimidated and prevented from participating. In some southern counties, less than a third of all eligible African Americans were registered to vote, whereas nearly two-thirds of eligible white voters were registered in the same counties. During the summer of 1964, thousands of civil rights activists, including many college students, worked to register black voters in southern states where black voter registration was dismal. Within months, 250,000 new voters had been added to the voting rolls. However, because of violent attacks on thousands of civil rights activists and the murder of 3 black activists in Mississippi in the summer of 1964, which is what the movie Mississippi Burning is based on, Congress determined that it needed to enact a federal law to eliminate discriminatory local and state government registration and voting practices. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned voter registration practices such as literacy tests. Moreover, the Voting Rights Act mandated federal intervention in any county in which less than 50% of eligible voters were registered. One component of the Voting Rights Act provided for periodic review of some of its tenets. After a specified period of time, Congress must pass and the President must sign an extension of the law to have those requirements remain in effect. In 2006, President George W. Bush signed legislation extending the Voting Rights Act for 25 years. In 1968, in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's murder on April 4th, Congress passed and President Lyndon Johnson signed an additional piece of civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 sought to end discriminatory practices in housing, including mortgage lending and the sale of rental of housing. The act was also banned the practice of steering, in which realtors would steer African American families to certain neighborhoods and white families to others. National civil rights laws enacted since the 1960s have made de jure segregation and discrimination in housing and credit opportunities illegal. However, de facto segregation, the segregation caused by the tendency of people to live in neighborhoods with others of their own race, religion, or ethnic group, still prevails in many communities throughout the United States today. The culmination of many acts of resistance by individuals and groups, the civil rights movement has had a momentous impact on society by working for the laws and rulings that bar discrimination in employment, public accommodations, education, and housing. The movement has also had a profound impact on voting rights by establishing the principle that the laws governing voter registration and participation should ensure that individuals are permitted to vote regardless of their race. As a result of the Voting Rights Act in Mississippi, for example, the percentage of African Americans registered to vote jumped from 7% in 1965 to 72% in 2006, and then to 82% in 2008. Today, in some states, including Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, a greater percentage of African Americans are registered than whites. In addition, all states, especially those in the South, have seen an increase in the number of African Americans elected to serve in office at the state, county, and municipal levels and in school districts. Indeed, more African Americans serve in elected office in Mississippi than in any other state, and all southern states boast among the highest number of African Americans elected officials. In addition to having a profound impact on race relations and civil rights laws, the civil rights movement soon came to be regarded by other groups as a model of political engagement. Ethnic minorities, women, persons with disabilities, and gays and lesbians have adopted many tactics of the movement in their own quest to secure their civil rights.